Welcome to the Dr. DigiPol show, and I am Alan Rosenblatt, aka Dr. DigiPol. Thank you for your patience. We are up and running and ready to go. Today, we're going to be talking about Cuba technology and normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba, with the National Network on Cuba, with our guest Nalda Vigezzi, Greg Klave, and Cheryl LaBash. Let me bring up Nalda to say hello, and then we'll move our way through the other guests. So, Nalda, you are now on the air. Hi, welcome to the Dr. Digipol show.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I seem to have just lost
Yes,
your
and
audio.
thank you for engaging in this topic.
Here we go. Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. This is a pretty interesting topic and quite a time to be talking about it. There's been with Fidel Castro's death and the slow change to normalization of relationships with Cuba that preceded that. This must be a very interesting time for your organization and for your community.
It, you know, it's interesting because there's always something happening in Cuba that makes it an interesting time. But I fully agree. It is an interesting time, and it's a challenging time for those of us in the United States to speculate and analyze on what's going to happen next vis-a-vis US-Cuba relations.
Yeah. So first, tell us a little bit about your organization.
Uh-huh. The National Network on Cuba is the umbrella organization for many dozens of groups, several dozen groups throughout the country who do Cuba solidarity work. And by solidarity, I mean respecting Cuban sovereignty, working to end the embargo/blockade, allowing normal travel, maintaining or initiating normal relations between the United States and Cuba, and not engaging in so-called regime change schemes, etc. Um, and we partner with an organization in Cuba, the Cuban Institution for Friendship with the Peoples of the World. So they're sort of our sister organization, if you will. And so what we do is as a member-based organization, groups work in different areas and in different times on different topics, different themes, different campaigns. So among our organizations is IFCO Pastors for Peace and the Venceremos Brigade. Both organizations have been challenging the travel ban for decades, and that's their focus. There are also organizations such as the National Lawyers Guild who clearly are focused more on legal aspects. We were very heavily involved in the campaigns to free the Cuban Five, and I can go into that a little bit if there's interest in time to discuss that. So as I said, our organizations are based throughout the United States and have various agendas and focuses.
So, what has happened? How has the death of Castro affected the behavior of your organizations, the goals, the missions? Is this a good thing, a bad thing, an completely unknown thing?
Um, as the Cubans have said, Castro was one person. Certainly, he's the historic leader of the revolution. However, it has been made completely clear since his death that there will not be a cult of personality. Fidel Castro has stepped down from the Cuban presidency 10 years ago. The president now is Raul Castro. He has been in charge of the government for the past 10 years. He continues to be in charge of the government. He was elected by the Council of Ministers twice. in a democratic process, a parliamentary process. So I think that for most of us, for many of us, and speaking for myself, those of us involved in Cuba solidarity work and in respecting Cuban sovereignty and in admiring the gains of the revolution, it's certainly very sad, as it is when any great leader passes. However, it hasn't changed the focus of our work, and it hasn't changed the way that we will work. As I said, we respect Cuban sovereignty. As I also said, mourn the passing of Fidel Castro. However, Cuba's fate, Cuba's future is in the hands of the Cuban people.
So, in the United States, as you say, there's this network of organizations that you're associated with. There's a network of organizations that have quite a different viewpoint. What's the level of interaction between and among those two sides within the U.S.?
We do not have direct interaction with pro-embargo forces. We respect organizations that do Cuba work. As I said, there are a lot since the openings 2 years ago, and since the overtures, the more ability to travel, more trade, more commerce. There are a number of other players who are involved in that. And each of them have a little bit different focus. Their focus is not so much in supporting and respecting Cuba and the revolution, but rather in business interests or commercial interests or in tourism. One of our member groups, Global Exchange, is involved in travel, and they, among 100 other travel providers, have signed on to an organization called Respect, which is aimed at purposeful travel to Cuba, going to Cuba, interacting with people in a mutually respectful way, learning from each other, and not going as tourists who are not demanding, taking from the society and so forth. But as far as and we also do congressional work. We do advocacy. So we work with forces in Congress who are in favor of ending the blockade, lifting the travel ban, and so forth. And in our conversations in Congress, we've had meetings with congressional aides whose bosses, who's the Congress people, are opposed to changing the policy, ending the blockade. But one thing that's really important to remember is that even here in the United States, where there's so much misinformation and disinformation about Cuba, 75% of the US population in a brand new, within the past week, in a Pew Research poll, favor normalizing relations, and nearly that many in ending the embargo. So the overwhelming sentiment of the US people is in favor of having normal relations with our neighbor 90 miles away. Cuba has been misportrayed for decades in the US, but despite this misportrayal, many people want to travel to Cuba. Most people want normal relations, just as we have with every other country in the world, which they have and we have with every other country in the world. Cuba has superior relationships with the other countries of the world. And just to give you an example, for the past 25 years, there has been a vote in October at the United Nations condemning US policy toward Cuba. And each year that has passed overwhelmingly, each of the 25 years, with more support for Cuba and more criticism of the United States. And this year, for the very first time, the vote was 191 in favor of Cuba, in favor of condemning the embargo, 0 opposed, and only 2 abstentions, excuse me, one of which was the United States.
So the United States even abstained against its own policy.
The United States abstained against its own policy, and
I
that
guess that
obviously
sounds
for the
reflective
first
of
time.
the 75%. But I'm very curious because, you know, when I hear about public opinion among the Cuban community about
Hmm.
about Cuba, mostly you hear the other side. They seem to be louder. Can you tell me? I know 75% of Americans are in favor of normalization. What percentage of Cuban Americans are in favor of normalization?
You know, I actually have the Pew report in front of me,
Right.
so I'll check now to see if that's it. But there's also a generational factor to consider, and many of the vocal Cubans are wealthier, they're older, they still have memories of what Cuba had been in the late 50s, early 60s. Um, I don't have the breakdown with by Cuban Americans, but I do recall reading another Pew study a few months ago, which showed that the majority of Cuban Americans were in favor of lifting the embargo. So
So this
you know, it's
generation.
really a very small number of people who have the loudest voices, and honestly, they have the most money, and they
So
have
this,
historic privilege. They have historically had access to the decision makers.
so you're what I'm hearing is that there are basically two factors that sort of predict the breakdown. One is generational. The other is wealth, what they lost among the
Hmm.
older generation in that respect. And it was an awfully long time ago.
It was an awfully long time ago. And, you know, it's funny because even among a lot of these older um, Cubans who left in the late 50s, early 60s, who are opposed to openings, who are opposed to normalizations. You know, they don't care if everybody else in Cuba starves, but they want to take care of their own families. So it, it, you know, the policy does not make sense. And when you see what Cuba is like, when you see the way Cuba interacts with the rest of the world, when you see what Cuba has given to the rest of the world in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of solidarity, um, it it's it really demonstrates that Cuba is a country to be admired, not to be blockaded.
Can we speak momentarily about what your thoughts are with regard to the incoming Trump administration, and then we'll bring Greg and Nalda, Greg and Cheryl on to talk a little bit about
Sure.
some of the work you're
You
doing.
know, I think like most people, I am flummoxed when it comes to Trump. He has said a lot of things at a lot of times during the campaign. Most recently, he said that he wants to strike a quote unquote better deal. Um, and failing that, he will withdraw all of the presidential decisions that were made and that have been made, because these were not congressional agreements. Rather, they were made under presidential authority, and Trump can withdraw them at any time. His advisors, his Cuban American advisors, are from the extreme right wing. So it remains to be seen. However, there is also a large business community who are involved in travel. You know, these airlines have gotten permission to fly into Cuba. There are cruise ships that have permission to fly into Cuba. There are joint ventures with hotel chains So to do away with all of those is very problematic. It's less problematic to cut off travel for normal people who fit into one of the approved categories of travel. But in terms of business interests and the kinds of pressures that he'll face from the business community, it's somewhat different. But again, I don't know. Early on in the campaign, Trump was all in favor of normalizing relations. There was a report that even several years ago that he went to Cuba to investigate business opportunities. To have a Trump hotel in Havana on the Malecon. That's another one of his interests. Now, how that conflicts, how his personal interests conflict with his presidential interests, I don't know. It remains to be seen. But there is a
Well, so
lot
much.
more that can happen both positively to improve relations, to normalize relations, and there's a lot that can happen negatively.
Yeah, I think that's the case with a lot of what we're looking forward to. Well, let me bring Cheryl up for a moment and talk to her for a little bit, and then we'll bring Greg up. Thank you very much, and we'll bring you back if we just raise your hand if you have a comment to chime in. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome, Cheryl. How are you?
Hi, Alan. It's good to meet you in person.
Likewise, likewise. So, how long have you been working with the organization?
I've actually been working with the organization on and off since it was formed in the early 1990s.
Okay, and are all three of you Cuban Americans or
None of us are.
none? Okay. Oh. So, what brought you to what got you involved in this project in the first place?
What got me involved is in 1985, I traveled to Cuba. I was on the executive board of my City of Detroit AFSCME local at the health department there. At that time, infant mortality in the United States was scandalous and astronomical, and in fact, in many communities like Detroit now, it still is. When I went to Cuba, I had found that they had put a priority on health care and making sure that all the children, all the babies are born healthy. They have made so many strides in lowering infant mortality. I think it's under 5 per 1,000 live births, which is unheard of in a developing country. And it's certainly better than we have in Detroit right now, which is around 12 or 13 per 1,000 live births.
So, that sort of suggests that, at least in terms of kind of old school technology, Cuba is pretty, takes it pretty seriously. What about access to social media and the web in Cuba? Is the work that you're doing online visible to the people in Cuba?
Yes, absolutely. It is. It's visible to people in Cuba. And even more important, what Cuba does is visible to us. I remember as a young person being anxious to get a copy of their newspaper, Granma, and it would take literally months to get a paper copy. Now, online, on my phone, I can access that every day. I can communicate with people in Cuba over Twitter. I can really, there's a lot of misinformation about access to the internet in Cuba. The percentages, I think, are about the same as in Detroit. What Cuba has done is prioritized the resources to make sure that educational and medical institutions first have the best access to the internet. Now, there are cables that go all around Cuba, transmission cables. Cuba has never been allowed to access those. So access to the internet has been through satellite and that sort of thing, which is very expensive. The things that people I know in Cuba are telling me is that the government will say, okay, we're going to roll out more internet, or we're going to roll out more cellular phones, or that kind of thing. And that development continues to progress in a way that's known. Here, there's many people who here in Detroit, I'm speaking, there are many people who have no access to the internet, and no one really cares. In fact, many things can't be, many services can't be accessed now without the internet. And they say, well, okay, there's a library over there. In Cuba, you do not need that in order to access your services and everything else that you need. Here, it's a little bit of a different story, and the digital divide is very serious.
And going to this, misinformation or popular understanding of Cuba and the internet. I remember reading several years ago that they opened up access to the internet for the people. Do they block any websites similar to the way China operates?
I'm actually, the blocking takes place on our side. I know somebody who runs an internet, web-based information website called Cuba News. His website was not visible in Cuba, even when he was in Cuba writing for it. It was blocked by Earthlink. Earthlink would not allow it to be shown in Cuba. So it's not necessarily on the Cuban side that there are problems. I mean, we have to remember that we live in the country that has blockaded Cuba and tried to isolate Cuba since 1962, to isolate it in every way. And the reason 2 years ago on Saturday that there became an opening between the United States and Cuba is, and President Obama said it, the United States, in fact, had become isolated. Really, we are the ones here in the United States who have been denied access to Cuba and what's happening in Cuba by the news outlets, the major big business news outlets, and the internet has allowed us to have more access and to have more direct communication and have more understanding about what's happening in Cuba. And for example, the whole week of mourning for Fidel Castro, I watched it on the internet. I watch Cuba. Yeah, go ahead.
So it sounds like as part of our blockade of Cuba, being access to content coming from the United States to Cuba and access to commercial websites in the United States to Cuba as sort of part of that blockade. Is that correct?
I think it has been. I think we have to look at how the internet and digital communication has also progressed. I think it's become more difficult to block communication with Cuba now. I mean, we were prohibited from traveling. We still are prohibited from traveling, in fact. You have to check off that you are one of 12 categories in order to legally board an American Airlines flight that goes to Cuba.
Right. I think Nalda has a comment. I'm going to swap her for a moment. If you hold on one second.
As Cheryl was speaking, was her statement that she reads the Grandma daily over the internet, as do I. And one of the criticisms of Cuba that we hear over and over and over again is lack of press freedom, lack of information. And the statements on December 17th, 2 years ago, of both President Castro and President Obama were published in the Granma. I'm not familiar with any newspaper in the United States that published President Raul Castro's remarks that day. So you have to take everything in context. And sometimes what we think of as freedom of the press, when you're reading the same thing, in virtually every mainstream publication, you really need to question it, and you really need to look at things a little bit differently.
So Cheryl was talking about how she interacts with people on Twitter in Cuba. Do you use Twitter as well to talk to people there?
No, I personally do not.
Okay.
I don't talk to
I'm
people
actually
in the United States on Twitter either.
well, that's it's one step at a time, I suppose, right? Let me. I want to bring. Actually, I want to ask Cheryl a couple questions about that because I'm really curious about that. So let me swap her back. Sorry, we only do one. We can only put one person up at a time. So Cheryl.
Here we go.
Oh, you're coming back. Hi, Cheryl. So you mentioned that you interact with people in Cuba on Twitter. And, again, back to this, popular conventional wisdom here is, that, this is a country that suppresses free speech. Tell me, do you get the sense that the people you talk to on Twitter are fearful about what they say to you?
Not at all. Not at all. And actually, when you travel to Cuba, you find out. Actually, Alan, you should come to Cuba with us. You'll find a lot of people who are very much into technology, very, very much. And one of the things and people who tell you all of their criticisms, all of their complaints, really, no, people are not afraid to talk about how they feel and what they think and what their criticisms are. There's also Facebook. I have Facebook friends who are in Cuba. I communicate with them on Facebook as well. It's not the way things have been presented. There's one of the things that since, I think it's since 2 years ago, has been the opening up of these public Wi-Fi places. You'll go like all over Cuba, in parks, not just in Havana, but really across the country, in public spaces where people can access the internet, and through emo, which is a app on my iPhone, you can actually have a video conference call. So people are talking to their friends around the world, their family members, freely in public parks where there's Wi-Fi accessibility. And as Cuba develops economically, the access will become more. They want to make sure that the developmental areas in health have the primary internet capacity. But as they can do it, they're rolling out more for the people generally.
So before we get into talking about how your organization, NNOC, is using the internet to influence U.S. policy, a little bit more about what people are saying on social media in Cuba. Do you get the sense that when they offer criticisms about their own country, that the government's listening and is responsive?
Very much so. On Fridays, Grandma publishes people's complaints, and the elected officials there actually have to respond. They have direct recall of elected officials. If the person in your local area is not answering your issues, you can vote to have them recalled and put somebody else in there, and it happens. These are things that most people here in the United States don't know. I would suggest that people contact Arnold August, who is he is connected with one of the universities in Canada. He's a Canadian author, and he's done research and has written books about the election procedures in Cuba. So yes, they do.
So, okay. So Nalda mentioned that the president is elected through a council, but you're saying that the parliamentarians themselves are directly elected, or is it a party election, like you elect the party and then proportional representation, or is it individual parliamentarians being elected?
It's individuals. It's irregardless of whether you are a member of the Communist Party. It is done community-based. It's done through your, through your cities, through your, the divisions in the country, the geographical divisions. So they have a very complex and regular election process there. And by the way, here in the United States, we have all of these issues about who's a registered voter. In Cuba, when you turn 16 years of age, you are a registered voter by virtue of being 16.
And I guess the question, I'm sure, is on the minds of some of our audience is, does Cuba have to worry about Russia interfering in its elections through cyber hacking?
No way. They do paper ballots there. They do paper ballots. And actually, we should think about that too and have the school kids guard the ballot boxes in the neighborhood like they do in Cuba.
All right. So I want to turn to some of the stuff that that you're doing online to advocate for your policies here. Do you want to talk about that, or should I bring Greg in at this point?
I don't know, Greg. What do you think? You want to talk about those web shots?
Why don't I bring Greg in, and then if you have another comment, just raise your hand, and I'll bring you back.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Let me find Greg. Give me one moment, Greg, and I'll bring you up.
He's chatting.
He's chatting. Okay, Greg, I'm going to put you on screen, so you better stop chatting.
Hey.
Welcome, Greg. How are you today?
Thank you, Alan. Good. A little cold here in Minnesota, but
where are you?
Minnesota.
Minnesota.
I'm in my fish Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota.
It's really cold there right now. I have a colleague that's moving there this very soon, and I don't know how she wants winter, but she doesn't want cold. She wants snow more than winter, right? Tell me, Greg, what kind of stuff are you guys doing in terms of, how are you trying to persuade Congress and the executive to continue normalizing relationships with Cuba, and how are you leveraging social media, email, websites, all that stuff?
Well, I think, right now there's a avalanche of activity regarding Cuba in each of our areas. And it's a matter of organization to make people aware of that activity through the internet, websites, Facebook, Twitter, etc., to try to get the word out there and broadcast it to people that use those platforms.
And do you use any advocacy tools that match people up to their member of Congress, like so they put in their address so that they can communicate directly with their own elected officials?
Yeah, there's a wide range. Besides, even there's many groups involved, and so some of our lobbying organizations in Washington, D.C., Latin American Working Group, Washington Office on Latin America, Center for Democracy in the Americas, etc., use kinds of tools when there's issues coming up in Congress. Of course, Congress is blocking a lot of action, so a lot of times our actions may be directed to the administration, since they do have the power to make changes in the policy without the approval of Congress.
What are your thoughts about the incoming administration and that particular route of action? Do you think what's your gut tell you? Is it going to be harder or easier to make things happen?
Well, it's yet to be seen. And again, as Nalda said, the openings that have happened in regards to business have put dollar signs in many of the corporations' eyes. And so we have to use the arguments that if the new administration wants to create jobs, then ending the embargo on Cuba will create thousands of jobs and millions of dollars of revenue for American companies. Besides that, again, we have to use the arguments that the embargo and the travel ban is a overreach of government regulations on the freedom of the American people to trade and travel with whom they please. So I think with that and the threat that the policy that we are now used to is going to be reversed, that you will see many more people involved in the campaign to end the embargo and travel ban. And we have to position ourselves in order to handle that influx of new interest in new people and really build a organization, a movement from bottom up.
Right. Are there any other countries in the world that have the same kind of travel and trade restrictions that we have with Cuba?
No, none other.
None other.
Nobody else.
Interesting. Yeah. Certainly.
In fact, one of the, as Nalda was pointing out, one of the reasons that the United States is voted against in the United Nations every year is because of that embargo policy is extraterritorial. It affects the companies in other countries from trading with Cuba. And it's that policy that has isolated the United States and put them in the place where they could not even support their own policy because everyone is against it. And
right.
And we're just, you know, it's continuing to isolate us from the rest of the world and especially our neighbors in Latin America.
I totally understand. Let me bring Nalda back up. She says she's got a comment. So give me one moment here. And swap. Yeah. You are back, Nalda. Hey, welcome back.
Actually, I think I might have raised my hand in error because I didn't have an additional comment, but as long as I have the opportunity,
Please.
I think that it is important to know that the U.S. policy, as Greg said, is extraterritorial, that it punishes other nations who trade with Cuba. And this has led to a lot of the economic difficulties that Cuba is going through, so that a ship that docks in Cuba is not then allowed to dock in the United States for a period of time. Banks that do business in Cuba are being fined millions of dollars. So all of this jeopardizes any other country that wants to have normal trade and yet also wants to have normal trade, normal relations with the United States, so that goods that could easily be shipped, for instance, from Louisiana, rice, to Cuba have to, until very recently, go through a third country, and Cuba is paying extra because of the shipping costs and is also paying extra because of the policy that country has to adhere to.
Interesting. Well, it certainly seems like things had been moving in the right direction, and we are now in a state of wait and see. I know that you said it's up in the air. As I asked Cheryl, what does your gut tell you? Or as I asked Greg, does your gut tell you that it's going to be good, or you just really have no idea what Trump is going to bring to the table?
Well, I want to be optimistic,
Right.
but I don't have very much to look forward to in the Trump administration at all. And again, this is my personal observation, my personal opinion. However, I do have faith in the people of the United States wanting to have good relations with their neighbors. I have faith that we are open to relationships, that were open to trade, that were open to just the kinds of normal activities that neighbors have. And I'm also very aware of the generosity of Cuba. For instance, right now, Cuba has a very advanced medical technological sector, so that they have drugs, they've developed their own pharmaceuticals that treat cancer, and that treat cancer very effectively. One of those treatments is now being tested in upstate New York. They also have a medication that they have developed that combats the effects of diabetes that often leads to limb amputations. And if those kinds of things were available to people in the United States, and that kind of medical resources where there is such need, as Cheryl was pointing out, the need for medical care in the United States is so great. And this is technology, and this is skills, and this is care that Cuba is sharing with the world and is willing to share with the United States, not due to a profit motive, but as as Cuba would say, it's debt to humanity.
Right. All right, so I'm going to do something a little tricky now. I'm going to put Cheryl up on one screen and her photos up on the other, which means that I will go away. And that means that you will not be able to hear me. Cheryl, just tell me when to advance the next photo, and then let's try to wrap this up and go through them, and then we'll say goodbye, and I'll finish up the show after that. So all set? Ready? I'm going to put Cheryl up first. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
Okay, so here goes. You can always IM me with more information as you've been doing. I'm going to put the pictures up in a moment.
As you know, the U.S. is a very large country, and one of the ways that we've been trying to deal with that is through webinars. Our first experience with a webinar was this one. It was about travel. We did it in June. We're planning on doing another one in the beginning of next year, perhaps about Guantanamo. One of Alan had asked about what do we do, or what things are we involved in. There are 3 city councils, and probably more adding, that have passed resolutions reaffirming the desire of their residents to end the blockade of Cuba. And this is a slide that we used in the webinar. Then we also have educational materials that people can use in a more traditional sense in meetings, house meetings or other meetings. And one of them is this new video that was done by the International Committee for Peace, Justice, and Dignity, All Guantanamo is Ours, that explains what the Guantanamo Naval Base in Guantanamo Province, Cuba, means to the people who live there, both historically and currently. So that's something else that's available. It's just one of many things that we have and do.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really happy that you guys have joined us. This has been very illuminating. It's always good to get some information that sort of busts some myths. I've always been a big fan of that, and you've done just that. So good luck with the work. Good luck with dealing with the next administration.
Can we add you to our email list?
Absolutely. And we'll I'll keep tabs on what you guys are doing, and thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having us.
So we are. I just want to take a few minutes towards the end of the show here. We're about ready to wrap it up, but I wanted to point out a couple of things in the news. Just we'll say hello to Ken and Ben, who are off traveling today on assignment. And a couple things that have really been focusing on me. We've talked a lot in the past about, or a bit in the past about the Trump campaign's use of a firm called Cambridge Analytica to do psychographic profiling of American voters based on data that they've been collecting on 230 million Americans. And then in particular, they focused on white liberal Democrats, African Americans, and I think to some extent women, and used this analysis to target dark Facebook ads in order to deliver negative ads designed to suppress their vote, make them not want to turn out to vote, and do it in such a way that nobody gets to see the posts that they were sharing except for the people who get delivered the post. That's what the idea of a dark Facebook post is. This is an interesting strategy. Essentially, you can do this yourself. You can go onto your Facebook page, post something, hide it, and then promote the hidden post. And it's not on your page, and so only the people who are delivered the post can actually see it. And you can target it quite specifically. One of the interesting things, leaving aside whether or not it worked or whether or not that stuff worked, and if you recall last week we were speaking with David Karp from GW University, where he was talking about how it was their explanation that it worked was all based on models predicting it would work, but not on hard evidence that it did work. And it does seem that it's too soon to really have hard evidence whether or not it worked or not. But one thing that is happening with this Cambridge Analytica firm, which is a British firm, is that it is in negotiations right now to get a big contract with the White House. Now, leading these negotiations, or central to these negotiations on behalf of the Trump administration for the White House, is Steve Bannon, the former CEO of his campaign, his top strategist and advisor in his administration based on his announcement, former publisher of Breitbart News. And at Breitbart, he was advocating, he had basically quite publicly championed the fact that he had turned Breitbart News into a platform for distributing news to serve the, as he called it, the alt-right community, or as most of the major news publications are now referring to it, the white supremacist movement, the white nationalist movement in the United States, which, while the alt-right is not exclusively them, the overlap is tremendous. And so that's one side. But what's most troubling about this is that Steve Bannon is also on the board of directors of Cambridge Analytica. So here he is, he's negotiating on behalf of, as part of the team of the White House, for a contract with a company who he has an interest in serving on the board of directors. This is your classic conflict of interest. And as you've seen in the news across the board for the last month or so, that conflict of interest with the Trump administration is a huge problem. That he's promised to give to talk about how he was going to clear up his business conflicts, and then he canceled his press conference, which was supposed to be today. Now we don't really know what he's going to do. With respect to Trump's role in the Apprentice, he's still staying on as executive producer. And when people were complaining that were reporting in the news that's a conflict of interest, he accused the Washington Post and New York Times of being fake news, because he says it's not true. That yes, he's going to be the executive producer, and yes, he has a large stake in the show, but it will involve zero work. Now, this is a problem. This is what he tweeted, and it reveals a very serious disconnect, because the issues of conflicts of interest are not about whether or not he has time to do any work. We don't care if he has time to do work, because we've hired him to be the president and that's his job. The issue of conflict of interest is whether or not he's making money from it, not whether he's doing work on it. So if Trump is still making money off of all of his business deals, but not doing any work to make it happen, it still creates a conflict of interest. This is a very big problem. And I think that, we see this from Trump's tweets frequently. We see this diversion away from the actual issue in order to, with his defense of it in very emphatic terms. Take another example. It had been released in the news that he was refusing to take his daily national security briefings, opting instead to be briefed only once a week. And his response to criticisms about that is he says, I'm smart enough not to need them. Well, again, it's not about how smart he is. It's about how much information he has. The smartest person in the world, if they don't have the information they need to make the right decisions on a particular issue, cannot apply their smarts to the problem because they are ignorant of the facts. You need to know the information that you're making your decisions, that you're applying all those great smarts to. And so consistently we see that when it comes to stepping up to the responsibilities of the president, to have no conflicts of interest, to be well informed about the issues that the president is ultimately responsible for managing, we find that when Donald Trump is defending himself on Twitter with regard to the way he's dealing with things, he seems to completely miss the point of what a conflict of interest is and what it means to be, the value of knowing what's going on in the world so that you can apply your smarts to it. So I urge everybody to pay attention to what he's tweeting, because it is the window into what he's thinking. And when he makes these statements that are at odds with reality, we need to call him on it. We need to push back on that. We cannot let him change the narrative of what the issue is. Conflict of interest is not about how much time about the fact that he's not going to spend any time doing stuff. It's about whether or not he's going to make money off of things that may come in conflict with the national interest. And when it comes to national security briefings, it's not about how smart or not smart he is. It's about whether or not he has the information he needs to make those smart decisions. So let's keep the pressure up on social media. Let's call him out. Let's make sure that we don't let him convince the world, the country, the people, that what he's saying is actually the reality of the ground. We need to hold him to the fire for conflicts of interest. We need to make sure that he is prepared and has all the information he needs in order to be an effective president. Because the last thing we want him to do is to get into office and make mistakes like he did with Taiwan and put us at risk of war, or or pursue business deals that put his business interests ahead of, or negotiate national security issues that put his business interests ahead of the United States and the people. We don't want that. And I don't really think he wants that either. I would hope he doesn't want that. And so we need to make sure that he doesn't divert attention from what's going on, and that we are able to make that hold his feet to the fire. And that's why, in this case, social media, because we have a president who is so committed to using it, is so crucial, because it allows us to see what he is saying, see into his mind, get a sense of how he's framing the issues, and make sure that we can push back and clarify what it is the people expect of the president, because he works for us. He does not work for himself anymore. He now works for the American people. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the tips and politics section today, and say thank you so much for coming to the Dr. DigiPol show, and look forward to seeing you on another episode. And so it's time for a little bit of outro music and some head popping, and enjoy the rest of your week.